Hello, welcome to NX After Dark. It's very dark in Denmark, very late. Just spending this final time of the final hours actually of this week. We're going to do something fun. We're going to be continuing on our case study of the Angular 2 of Heroes routing tutorial. And the past few episodes, I think I extracted some feature page libraries from this single project Angular application, the Two of Heroes routing tutorial, which has several features. Let me share my screen here again and we can take a look because it's all open source right here on GitHub. My profile ACDK. NX Angular 2 of Heroes is the name of this repo. Post it here in the comments, so hopefully you can find it yourself. Add it to the description once I remember to do so. Yeah, that's another topic. Yeah, let's see here. So this is the repo. We have this one app, Two of Heroes app, but as you can see, there's not much left now. I did remove some additional stuff since last time I recorded. And actually, let's try to fire up this, the dep graph, the dependency graph of NX, because this is an NX workspace now, even though it started as an Angular CLI workspace. So here are all the projects by now. The Two of Heroes app, we have an admin feature page. So it's a feature library in the admin scope or grouping folder, domain, whatever. And it's the page feature library. So we also have a login page feature for the auth domain. We have a heroes page feature. We have a crisis center page feature. And each of these then uses some shared libraries, as we can see. Even currently, the app itself uses a shared UI library with navigation components. So just to show you, since last time I think I extracted out this page not found component, I created a scam for it. I extracted this route animations, the slide in animation to this library as well. And is there anything else new? No, that might have been it. That might have been it. So now in this app routing module, we have this the pop-up outlet. So not the primary router outlet, but in the pop-up, we have this compose message component, which is also in the shared UI library for dialogues. We have the admin feature. We have the crisis center feature, which is also in a feature page library. And we have the default route here redirecting to superheroes. So where might that be? And I don't know whether it's made this way because of demonstrating something in this router tutorial of Angular. It probably is. But you see, we don't have any routes for the superheroes and the villains defined right here in our app routing module. But that's because the modules are actually imported directly here. So there's no lazy loading of the heroes feature page. See, there's no heroes up here. This is a feature module, but it also contains routes, which it shouldn't, at least not that many. And the same, I guess, for login. Yeah. So if we go and take a look at this heroes feature page module, see that it has its own routing module. And this is the reason. See right here that we both have heroes, hero, superheroes, and superhero. prefixes to the route paths in this feature, which is kind of strange. But it wouldn't be easy to it'll be kind of difficult to lazy load this because they have 4 different route patterns, but it would be doable. But that's something for another day. Today, I actually want to, but just to understand that when we put the modules right here in imports, they are eagerly loaded. So they will be part of the main chunk of our application. So it's 2 additional features that are loaded every time the application is booted up. And a good rule of thumb is lazy load everything. Even if it's the default page, people are going to visit the app on different pages, not only the default page. So why load the default page if you're going to some other feature most of the times? Anyways, we will be looking at, I think we're going to look at the Crisis Center feature. So let's find that one. It's here. Yeah. So this is the Crisis Center feature page module. And you should see that this is the one we're routing to here, a lazy route path. So every route that begins with Crisis Center is going to lazy load this module by using this import path. And this import path is defined in the tsconfig base JSON file right here. It's a path mapping, so it'll be in compiler options, paths, and what was it again? Crisis Center, right? So once we import from that path, it will map into this path in our workspace. So not apps, but libs, Crisis Center, feature page, source, index ts. So that's the barrel file or the public API of this library. And the NX workspace linting rules will prevent us from making deep imports beyond this public API or barrel file. So this library is currently only exporting this feature module right here. So that's the interesting one for today. We're going to, because we just stuffed everything in here in the first episodes. We took everything from the Crisis Center folder in the original app project. There was a Crisis Center folder right here, and we stuffed it right down here without changing much, if anything at all. But of course, one feature should usually not be in just one library. So there's a feature library, right? But I'm talking about an Angular feature, as in a whole part of your application, a whole domain or subdomain or bounded context, whatever you want to call it, or a page of the app. Everything about the Crisis Center, that's an Angular feature. And we usually need more than just this one library for that. But today we're going to look at a very neat pattern, or it's a pattern, and there's a few variations. It's called, see if I can find my browser. Here it is. It's called the shell library pattern, or actually, the shell library pattern. There's 3 of them. This is an article I authored together with Nacho. He's the main author, and I guided him. We came up with some ideas and concepts, and we are, I very much recommend this article, by the way. It should be in the YouTube chat, and I'll put it in the description at some point as well. When I remember, if you happen to Google this, you'll probably end up on the Medium version, but that's the old Angular in-depth blog. You should go to indep.dev to find the real one and the most updated one. So this article introduces first the Narwhal feature shell library. That's the one from the Enterprise Angular Monorepo Patterns book. And The second one, we scroll down here, we'll look at some more soon, but the second one is, come on, it's a long one. Here it is, the Manfred Steyr shell library. So Manfred is really into domain-driven design, and he proposes a shell library per domain, which makes a lot of sense, and it's more flexible than the first one, which is this now feature shell library, where you have one shell library for every app, just one. But with the Manfred Steyr variant, you can have one per domain, and domains can be shared between applications. But that's not always enough. So as Nacho and I came up with the third shell library pattern, and it's called the composite shell library. This is the most flexible one of the three, because here, let's see if we can see this. I hope we can see this visualization, where we have two apps in this example app or workspace from the article. It's the Narwhal Airlines web app and the mobile app. And the web app has two domains, booking and check-in. But there's a composite feature shell library for web, booking for web, and one for the check-in for web. And it just happens that the mobile app also has a shell library for booking, but the mobile one, and one for check-in, also the mobile one. So what's different? Why could they not just share them with the Manfred Steyr shell library pattern? Well, here we see that in the check-in domain or bounded context, the web app is going to have a ticket finder feature and a check-in feature, while the mobile app only has the check-in feature. So its composition on the domain level and the application level. In the mobile app in booking, it only has the seat listing feature. The mobile one, that is, because there is another seat listing feature library here, but that's the one for web. So we created a specific one for mobile for this app. And the web app has two features in the booking domain, the passenger info feature and the seat listing feature. I hope this makes a little sense, because that's the whole purpose of this pattern, the composite shell library pattern. It's the most flexible one. And I mean, you can use either one, but this one is useful for certain cases where we want to create a special feature for a special app, and use the normal feature for the other apps maybe. So we can orchestrate on the domain level per application. If we go and see the similar diagram for the other patterns or the other variants of shell libraries, we'll have the Manfred Steyr one. It's here. So here we also have two apps, the Narwhal Airlines admin web app and the client web app. So admin and client for the regular users. So the admin web app has two domains, the booking domain and the check-in domain. So it imports the booking shell library and the check-in shell library. Booking has passenger info feature and the seat listing feature. Check-in has the ticket finder feature and the check-in feature. But the admin web app does not have the flight tracking domain. There's no orange line dependency graph here from the admin web app and to this domain, or the entry point to domain is this shell library, the flight tracking shell. but the client web app has the flight tracking domain. These two features, the flight search feature, the flight details feature. It also has this check-in domain. So these two apps are sharing this domain with the same routes and the same features. And that's where it's different from the composite shell library, that they have to share the same routes, the same features. They're sharing orchestration through this Manfred Steyr shell library per domain, one per domain. And the app then imports however many shell libraries or domains it wants to use. The original one from the Narwhal book, the Narwhal feature shell library, is illustrated like so. So in this example, we have three apps: the booking web app, the booking desktop app, and the booking mobile app. They all share one booking feature shell, and it orchestrates exactly the same routes and features from two domains: the booking subdomain, the shared seat map subdomain. So since they all share the same features, the same routes, the difference must be in the application projects, and they are. So we're pretending here that, or in the use case here is it's an adaptive layout. So say it could be browser agent sniffing to say, do you need a web, like a desktop layout? Do you need a mobile layout, or do you need a general web layout or tablet, whatever? Or they could be bundled and published in certain ways that are specific to the platform. This could be, the desktop one could be an Electron app for Linux, Mac, and Windows. The web app could be a progressive web app, and the mobile app could be an Ionic app, or some other hybrid web app, maybe published to the app stores. So they could share the same features, the same routes. Would that make sense? You might think no, but if you come to think about it, what about something like Slack or Discord? They try to have the same features on each platform. So that might be a good use case. Something like Spotify is also going back to sharing a code base, maybe not exactly the same routes, features on all platforms, but I bet they wish they had. Or, well, they are adapting to changing requirements and changing teams and new discoveries. So now they are, rather than having three different platforms with three different code bases, they're going back to trying to share the code base and sharing the features between the platforms. So that might make sense in some use cases. So this is a very valid pattern. This variant, the one we're seeing now, is the Narwhal feature shell. So you should get familiar with all these three variants of shell library, the shell library pattern for NX and monorepos, so that we can decide which one is the best for our use case. And I'm trying to figure it out myself as well. Let's have a look at the app. What's the best for our use case? So we have one app, right? Just one app. So right now it might be good to start with just one Narwhal feature shell library. On the other hand, we could have either a Manfred Steyr shell library per feature or domain, whatever we want to call it. So one for admin, one for auth, one for crisis center, one for heroes. That makes sense even when we just have one app, as we can see here. We could create one for each of them. And moving on to composite shell libraries, well, that only makes sense once you need to vary the features, the feature composition and orchestration per domain or per app. And since we just have one app, all domains are hopefully for that one app. Once we have multiple apps, we might decide, so which one do we need now? Can we keep using the Narwhal feature shell library or the Manfred Steyr shell library, or should we switch to composite shell libraries? I think I'm going to go with the Manfred Steyr shell library today. So for this app, we're going to look into the Crisis Center feature, finally, after this 20-minute long discussion. I hope it was interesting. And you can learn more in that article by Nacho Vasquez. So back to this Crisis Center feature page library, which is currently just a junk library for everything related to the Crisis Center. We have this one module that is exported by this library. It's the Crisis Center feature page module, which is a conventional name based on the library name, right? It's in the Crisis Center grouping folder or domain grouping folder. It's the feature, it's a type feature library, and it's the page. So this domain should have just one root level page. Well, that's the idea. Let's see if it sticks, if it fits for this domain. Okay, what do we have? We have 4 components. They are all declared in this one module, it seems. We have a routing module for the Crisis Center features. And we are importing common module and forms module. So they may or may not be used by either one of these 4 components or all of them. So, well, first thing is we actually need a different library now. We need a shell library for the Crisis Center. So let's start by generating that. So using the NX console, running the generate, and then searching for the Narwhal Angular library schematic. It should be called feature shell. You might, I'm using the conventional library type feature here, but this is actually a special one. So you might even prefix it with just shell Crisis Center. But since we're already in the Crisis Center grouping folder, you don't have to include this name. And I don't want to introduce another type of library just for the shell, at least not right now. So I'm going to prefix it with the feature type. So it's going to be called the Crisis Center feature shell module. Straightforward, right? Yeah. Do we need any settings here? We need the tags. We haven't added the linting rules yet, the workspace linting rules, but let's keep adding the tags as we go along, and we'll add those linting rules in another episode. I don't think we even have ESLint right now, since we started with the Angular CLI workspace, which was still using TSLint. Okay, the scope is Crisis Center. The type is feature. Generate this library, see what we get. Here it is, the feature shell library. Oh, and before I forget, one thing I also changed was I added these testing settings here. So I configured the test bed. There are these new options on teardown. You can destroy after each. This is should improve performance of testing modules. I think it was introduced in a recent version of Angular, like version 12 something. And especially with Karma, it's leaving behind the styles of every test. So they're just chunking up DOM elements and might be interfering with each other. And the on destroy methods of all the modules and services, things like that, might not even be called in certain circumstances, like root modules, or provided in root services and the modules, which also have on destroy hooks, actually, believe it or not. So yeah, this should be the default. I expect it will become that at some point. And even if you're using Jest, where the style issue is not an issue, you can still get the benefit of actually calling the hooks and tearing down some resources like subscriptions or allocated memory or whatever. And the other one is I'm defaulting to running or auto-detecting, running the change detection automatically on component fixtures by default now. Since I'm almost always using this option, I'm adding this to my default configuration here. And I might override it to false if I need to be very specific about the timing of change detection, to set something up before or very carefully control the change detection after changing something. Most of the times it's very nice to have it automatically run in test. It doesn't always work, but for some cases, which is nice, because no one wants to play the framework and call change detection after every single change in the test. That's just boring, waste of time. Until the point where you need that control of the timing. Yeah, so I'm changing that in this new project. We also need to change the README file. So this is the crisis center. So it's not a feature shell, it's a Manfred Steyer shell. So it's just a shell, domain shell, basically. What else? Yeah, we have the shell module. We're going to keep that, but I don't want the common module unless I need it. So I'm going to remove that. Yes, good. So I'm going to commit this. Usually I always create pull requests, but yeah, since I'm the only one working on this repo, yeah, let's just go with regular commits and push them to the main branch. I don't even think we set up a CI workflow yet, so no, pull requests don't make that much sense. So what are we doing? We are adding something to our app. We'll generate crisis center feature shell, crisis center shell library. There we go. There we go. We're on the way to starting to structure this feature better. It's the second library in this crisis center domain, so that we don't have a single one, the junk library for everything. So what should be in a shell library? Well, first of all, a shell module. So what's in the shell module is the next question. Yeah, it depends on the type, but it could have feature level or root level configuration and initializers. It could have routes for the specific feature, or the top level routes for an entire app, or the top level routes for the domain it belongs to. And oftentimes when it's the domain feature or domain shell module, such as the two variants, the Manfred Steyer variant and the composite shell library variant, these two types will usually have a shell component, or the shell component will have a scam, so it'll be shell module, or even shell scam. Why not? But let's see what we already have in the what's currently called the Crisis Center feature page module. And that's something we cut out and pasted from the app, the Two of Heroes app originally. So what belongs in this shell module? Routing for sure. So let's go to this router, Crisis Center routing module. And let's see. Yeah, I'm wondering, can we paste that over to our new shell library? But actually, no. We need that. We're going to probably need that shell component. But I think we already have something like that in this feature, but it's not called a shell component. It's called the Crisis Center component. So this is kind of the page module, or the page component for the Crisis Center. If we go and look at it, we'll probably find that it has a router outlet and most likely not much else. Let's go look at its template, in fact. Yeah, look at that. A router outlet and a title, Crisis Center. So this is a shell component. So let's keep that name. And let's start by, let's extract, starting by copying over these routes, importing the routes type, and keep the name, Crisis Center routes. I'm going to leave out the child component for now. So taking one step at a time. Now we need this Crisis Center component, but we also need the imports and exports here. Router module, taking that import from Angular router. And we're using the for child, which means that in the application, the application project, we're going to have 4 routes that points to this shell module, so that this whole feature is lazy loaded. So this is the first step. And now we need this Crisis Center component that is still in the feature page library. Let's find it. Where are you? This one. Okay, good. So I'm going to cut that into our shell feature library. Pasting it here. There it is, Crisis Center, these 3 files. And now we wish we had a scam, so we're going to have to create one ourselves. Crisis Center module TS, and creating an ng module. It's called Crisis Center module. It's going to declare only the Crisis Center component, which shouldn't be in this path anymore. Here it is. And so this is a routed component only. So we're not going to export it. That doesn't make sense. It's only going to be routed, so it's not going to be in any template of another component. But we have to see whether we need some imports. So going back to this component, the Crisis Center component, which is actually a shell component. Let's see what's needed for its template. So it has an H2 element. That's a native one, so we don't need Angular modules for that. But this one, the router outlet, we do need the router module for that. Now we have access to this router outlet directive. Yeah, good. That's a scam, a single component Angular module for the crisis center component, which is a shell component. So oftentimes I would call this shell module, and I would call this component a shell component. But let's keep the name here, and it's perfectly fine. You can use your own names, and this is a better name even, but yeah, why not? So now to route to this crisis center component, we have to import its scam, so the crisis center module. And the crisis center component. There we go. That's the first step. So refactoring, move shell component, shell. Okay. And next up is our application should now route to the shell module that we just created instead of the page feature, which we were using before. So instead of feature page, I'm going to use feature shell. Oh, we might need to restart the TypeScript language server. And it'll just take a second. And now, hopefully it's happy. Let's look at autocomplete. Yeah, it is. Very good. So now we have lazy loaded the shell library of the crisis center feature or domain. But it will just show this empty shell, which is why it's called a shell library. It's the shell around this feature, or it's the page, or yeah, whatever you want to call it. It's just going to say crisis center. It's going to have a router outlet. So to render anything, any routes in this nested router outlet, we're going to have to add child routes to the route that is, this is the top level route in the domain. There's another top level route in the application, which is routing to this module. This module is just then going to route to the components or the routes that are being rendered by the shell components router outlet. This one we saw before. So yeah, nested router outlets. A router outlet inside of the router outlet that's in the app component, right? We see it right here. Okay, so we need to add child routes. So let's go back to the routing module we had. This one, the crisis center routing module. And please feel free to ask questions if this is getting too complicated, and I'll try to explain it better. It's an advanced topic, but one that you are going to use all the time once you get familiar with using it. So yes, we have all these shell components. Well, yeah, this is kind of interesting. So this is the Two of Heroes routing tutorial. So it has basically every feature of the Angular router stuffed into this application. So we see nested routes inside of nested routes. That's kind of funny. And yeah, notice that we have an empty path route right here. It's kind of interesting. But it does have a component, and this means that this component must have that router outlet. So once we have another level of nesting here, this crisis list component must also have a router outlet. Otherwise, these routes, its child routes, wouldn't work. So let's just verify that so that I'm not assuming things about Angular that happens from time to time. No, here it is. So this is the third nested router outlet, the grandchild router outlet. Okay, so let's take them one at a time. We can't begin with the innermost, so we're going to have to start with this crisis list. So where does this component, the crisis list, where does that belong? And now we can, yeah, basically, this is a good candidate for a separate feature library, the crisis list. But yeah, it's always a balance of not getting too granular, but not having a junk library either with everything stuffed inside it. So I see the home component that might be a feature. I see the detail component that most certainly sounds like a feature, a separate feature, so a separate feature library. But what's in the crisis list? It seems that both of them, yeah, they are going to, it's going to be either the home component or the detail component in that router outlet area. So there's probably something else inside of the template of the crisis list. A list of crisis, maybe. Let's see. Let's see. Yeah, the router outlet. So this is going to render the home, crisis home, or the crisis detail component, depending on the active route. But up here, we also see that we have a crisis list component, or sorry, the crisis list, the list of crises. Here they are, all the crises from the crisis service. We're looping over them, and then we're adding a link to each crisis. And once you click that, it's going to be shown in the router detail component right here. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I'm wondering. I just had something disconnect in my docking station. Seems that I'm still live. Let me know if you can't hear me anymore or see my screen. And I'll try to restart some things. But here's my editor again. Hopefully you can see it now again. And yeah, so I'm sitting here wondering, should I create a separate feature for any of these? I mean, the shell shouldn't contain much because it's only the common parts of this whole domain, the common parts of the crisis. But we could argue that this crisis list is currently a common thing for this whole domain. Yeah. So also thinking about the future of this app, maybe we don't always want to show the list of these crises, but maybe we don't want to make assumptions about the future either, right? So it's a tough decision. But most strongly, I feel that I don't want more components in my shell library than the actual shell component. And yeah, so instead, we're going to add another feature library. But first, let's see, what did I change? Just closing some of this. What did I change? I changed the import in the app routing module. Yeah. Route to shell library. There we go. So we need another library. We need another Angular library from the Narwhal's NX Angular library generator. It's going to be called, it's a feature library, so that's the prefix of its name. It's going to be in the crisis center directory. So this follows the structure up here. It's going to be in libs because it's a library. So it's going to be in the crisis center grouping folder, and it's going to be called feature list. And we need the tags. The scope is crisis center. The type is feature. Generate this library, please, NX. Thank you for that. And I have to turn this, organize and save. I have to turn this off because I want to copy this testing setup again, and these first imports have side effects. So ordering matters. I have to import the first one before the second one, but alphabetical sort would put them in the other order. So that wouldn't actually work. So yeah, copying this to our new library setup or its tests here. And now I can add it back. The setting for my editor. I'm going to change the readme. This is the list feature. Crisis feature, I guess. Yeah, that's good enough. What else? So what is generated for us? A crisis center feature list module. Yeah, I tend to keep these conventionally named modules, except I don't want them to add any metadata before I need it. So this is good. Generate list feature library. It's crisis list feature library. And we're going to take that list component. And once again, we're going to need a module for declaring it. So we're going to create a scam, crisis list, module.ts. This is an ng module. It declares this crisis list component. Terrible import. Man. Will that work to save a few keystrokes, huh? Yeah. Oh, because I didn't add the class. Crisis list module. There we go. So what's wrong with the component? It's probably missing some modules to be able to do something in its template. So let's look at the template. Which module imports do we need? Router outlet, so we need the router module. What else? ng4, so that's the common module, so we didn't need that in here. Anything else? Router link, that's also from the router module. Async pipe is in the common module. The class binding doesn't require a module. Template expressions, yeah, that should be good. So why is it acting up? Probably just VS Code. I'm going to reload it. Spinning everything up again and seeing whether it complains now. It still complains. I'm not happy about that. Oh, okay. So it's because of broken imports. Yeah, well, this is actually great because structuring our application into all these libraries is forcing us to think about our architecture and where everything belongs. So, for example, where do we have the crisis class? Here in the page module. So this is a shared domain object, or actually domain entity, right? So it doesn't belong in a page feature library. It should be in a shared library, at least shared to this domain. So I don't mean shared down here, because that's shared across domains in the application, or maybe even across applications if you have multiple of those. But where does it belong then? And this is where we need a non-conventional library type, at least one that's not strictly defined in any novel resources I have read, or it might be mentioned but not defined very well. Well, first I should definitely commit these changes. Yeah, let's do that first. So once we get that component running, this feature list module is the entry point of this whole library. It's the only exported class. So here we need to do everything you need. Need to expose everything you need from this library. So it's going to be the crisis list module. There we go. So once you import this entry point module from this library, the feature library, you're going to have access to everything defined in this crisis list module, which is a scam, meaning you can now use the crisis list component. And we're probably going to have to export that component as well to be able to use it in routes. Or maybe the route should be specified here. Yeah, that's a nice option. I do that myself, actually. Yeah, we'll do that in a minute once we figure out where to put that crisis type and other things. Okay. So move, what are we doing here? Move crisis list component to list feature. Good. See if I can roll back to my train of thought. We were trying to find a place for the crisis domain entity, business object, whatever you want to call it. So let's look at the libraries we currently have. We have a feature list library. That's not where it belongs. The shell, definitely not there. The page feature library, not there either. So we have to generate a new library. And it's going to, and yeah, you can see that you can't be afraid of libraries and projects when working with NX, at least not when you're using it efficiently to define your architecture. And of course, we shouldn't be getting too granular because that will be a mess. But once we have a decent amount of libraries, the NX toolchain can help us depending on which features from it we're going to use, such as incremental build, the affected command for intelligent tests and builds and deployments and linting and all of that goodness. And also, of course, the build cache, the NX cache, which can be either local but also distributed through NX Cloud or an on-premise one. Okay, generating another library. It's going to be in the Crisis Center directory. Let's fill out the tags here. The scope is Crisis Center. And so what is this library? It's a domain library, and it could be domain of crisis, but we're in the Crisis Center, so I don't know. We probably just need one domain library for now, so just call it domain. The prefix can be the full name of the library as well, because we're inside of a grouping folder. The name of the library will actually be something like Crisis Center domain, which is a good descriptive name. Some call them type libraries. Some might call them, I don't know, interface libraries. We call them domain libraries. We have the interfaces of our domain entities or business entities, and we might have some pure functions as well, or we might have some, this is an anemic interface, but we might have some rich models as well, domain models, that is. Anyways, this is this new domain library. We're generating that. Need to remember to set up the tests configuration. I should really be creating a workspace generator for this, but that's a good topic for another episode, right? Oh, testing, and I have to turn off this organize and save temporarily. Here it is, saving, and I can enable organize and save again. I'm going to change the README file so that it says Crisis Center domain. Nice. And it has a module. The domain library shouldn't have an Angular module. It's a TypeScript library. So we can leave this barrel file empty for now, like so, exporting an empty object. And now we can say we're adding something, so it's a feature commit. Generate Crisis Center domain library. And now we're ready to locate this crisis. Here it is. This crisis interface. I'm going to be cutting it and pasting it into our domain library, into the lib folder. There we go. And we're going to export that right here. Nice. And once I have generated a library, I need to restart the TS server. So now, well, let's commit. Move crisis entity to domain library, or just domain. I don't know. Yeah. So now, where did we need this? We know that we needed it in the crisis list component. So there, to auto import. That's not a good import. So let's say add to heroes crisis center domain. There it is, right? Let's just check. Yeah, it's Let's export it. Nice. And now we need the crisis service. So where does that belong? Well, first, let me just update import. And now we need to look into this crisis service. Where is it currently and where does it belong? Here it is. And it also needs to update its import. This is center domain, like so. Going to update imports, changing it to single commit. Okay, so what is this service doing? It has some state, behavior subject. It's using a message service, or it's importing it but not actually using it. It's kind of fun. You can get a crisis. We can get all the crises. And we can add crisis or a single crisis. Yeah. Okay, so it seems that, yeah, it is only using these mock crises, so that we don't need a backend for these crises. Yeah, hey, Corbin. Nice to see you, Corbin. Crisis sounds scary. Yeah, it is. Let's see which crisis we have. We have a dragon burning cities. We have the sky rains, great white sharks, a giant asteroid heading for. Switch on my screen here so we can see it. A dragon burning cities. The sky rains, great white sharks. The giant asteroid heading for Earth, and procrastinators meeting is delayed again. What a crisis, huh? Yeah. Typical day in California. Yeah, exactly. Must be. And what are we working on? Yeah, we are working on, of course, an. Oh, where did I put this? Here it is. So we're working on this open source repository. I took the Tour of Heroes routing tutorial from Angular.io because it has a bunch of Angular features. That was a CLI, that was an Angular CLI workspace, so I converted that or migrated it to NX in one episode, and then I started taking that application project and splitting it into feature libraries. But that was just right now they are kind of junk libraries with everything in just one library, so that's not much better. So and you're from California, yeah. No hard feelings about the typical day in California. Yeah, so the next step from here, what we're doing today is we're actually going to introduce a shell library, and this interesting article by Nacho Vasquez and myself is explaining with code examples and visualizations the three different variants of shell libraries. There's one by Narwhal, we call it the Narwhal feature shell. It's in their book about Angular Enterprise monorepo patterns or whatever it's called. We have the Manfred Steyer shell library. And we have the third variant, which is the composite shell library, which is a concept that Nacho and I came up with to have maximum flexibility. So I explained them kind of earlier in this episode, and we decided to use the Manfred Steyer variant for our application. Okay, so another import that needs updating. Good. We'll get them all eventually. This will be an amend commit. Okay, our crisis service. So it's a state, kind of a state service with a subject, right? And it's not communicating with the backend, so it's a fake service right now, actually. So where does that belong? We have now seen a domain library. We've seen feature libraries. We've even seen page and shell libraries, which you might define as its own library type, but right now they're defined under the feature type. And what else have we seen? We've seen data access and UI libraries as well. So a state management service of some kind will usually be in a data access library. So this is probably only used in the crisis domain, this crisis service, but it will most likely also be used across the features, which is exactly why we need to extract it to a data access library now. So let's do that. Let's generate a library. We've done that several times by now. It's a data access, and that's the type. So I might give it a name, so it could be data access crisis. But since we're already in the crisis center grouping folder, the crisis center domain, I don't care to give it a specific name unless we need several data access libraries in here, and we don't right now. So let's stick with this. Scope is crisis center. These are our tags for this library. And the type is data access. Generating it. And I need this wonderful testing setup. And to use that, I have to turn off my organize and save feature temporarily, copying in this wonderful testing configuration here, saving it. Now I can re-enable my organize and save from TypeScript Hero, the extension. And what else do we need to change? The README file. So this is the crisis center data access. But what's in here? A module. This is data access library, so it's probably going to contain services and maybe some functions, class-based services mostly. So most likely we won't need any modules unless we are using Nginx store and Nginx effects, which we're certainly not going to use. I prefer Nginx component store instead these days. So we're generate crisis center data access library. There we go. And now we can take this crisis service, and it's using these mock crisis. So let's take them as well. We'll cut them out and put them right in here in the lib folder of this new data access library. So we need to export definitely this crisis service. And I need to restart my TypeScript server because it generated a new library which adds a new path mapping to my root TypeScript configuration. So Visual Studio Code is not watching that, I guess. So yeah, maybe if I did it manually down here, added this path mapping, it might detect it. I'm not sure, but it doesn't. So yeah, let's verify that our imports are valid now, the relative ones. The mock crisis, yeah, we have that right here. And the crisis is now from this domain library. Good. Same thing here. The crisis interface is from this domain library. Good. Seems like everything is in order in this library. So now we need to find the places where we're referring to the crisis service. So that is the case in this crisis list component. Let's see if we can auto import this missing import. No, we cannot. Let's copy this one and say data access autocomplete. Here it is, the crisis service. Very good. And now everything seems to be in order inside of the crisis list component. But let's also, for good measure, go into this crisis detail resolver service and update both of these imports. Oh, auto import is working. Nice. This one? Yeah. There we go. Oh, this one didn't work out well. Import from heroes, crisis center data access, crisis service. Nice. Organized imports. That's what I like. And everything in order here. Let's make sure if we have updated all the crisis imports. This one didn't yet. We'll fix that. Good. Very good. Very good. Move crisis service to data access. Yeah. And now if we had some workspace lint rules in place, we would need to make sure that it's a valid import. So for example, this feature library can import from data access. Yeah, that's a valid rule that I would have in my workspace. We're going to add those at a later point. I wonder what else it thinks is wrong. Oh, now it's happy again. Very good. I see a question in the chat. Alexander, hello. Do you plan to provide the Crisis Center at root or inside Crisis Center shell? Well, let's see how it is provided already as in this app. I didn't define it. So it's provided in root. And okay, so I've noticed that not everyone has the same mental map about how provided in root works. So I'll try to explain it here. Provided in root does not mean that. Let me share my screen again. I suck at switching screens. Okay, so here it is. Crisis Center or the crisis service is provided in root. And what does this mean? What it does not mean is it does not bundle this in the root chunk, the main chunk, our eagerly loaded chunk of the application. That's not what it means to provide in root. Provided in root means that even if it's a lazy loaded service because it's used inside of a lazy loaded feature, it will be a root level provider. So it will be a singleton. There will be one instance per root module, which usually means per Angular application that is bootstrap, or in the case of Angular elements, there will be one per Angular elements, which is kind of funny. If it's micro front ends, one per micro front end. But yeah, usually most times it's one per. It means one per application. So application-wide singleton. But it's perfectly fine to have it inside of a domain or a lazy loaded feature here. This crisis center, we could, I know the confusion about feature libraries and feature modules and Angular features. So yeah, okay, so let's say crisis center, let's call it the domain then. Crisis center is a lazy loaded domain. The crisis service is only used inside of the crisis center domain. Even though it's lazy loaded, everything in here is lazy loaded. It's perfectly fine to provide this crisis service in the root module, or the root module injector, actually. So how do I plan to provide it? Just like so, which was already done in the router tutorial. But it would, as things are right now, you're right. I could have provided it in the shell module right here. But so usually you have two options for this, right? You could say provide it in center feature shell module, but that would be a circular dependency. So instead, we should remove this provider option, and we should add it here in the old school way of having providers in our module. So here it would say crisis service, but the downside of this is the crisis service would always be included in the first bundle of this domain, the crisis center domain. Because now it's, worse than that, now it's not a tree shakeable provider anymore. It will always be part of this shell bundle. Whereas if we have provided in root, now we have a tree shakeable provider. So if no other parts of our applications are using this crisis service, it will not even be part of any bundle. But when one or more features are using it, it will be added to those. The code will be added to those chunks and shared between them somehow using Webpack and Angular Magic. I hope that kind of makes sense. So yeah, just keeping it provided in root. Let's go back to the crisis list where we, it's not even where we started, but it was the next step in defining this shell library for the crisis center. So the crisis list component is now able to import the crisis center from this data access library. Okay, if you provide the service in root, it's possible to use the service in another domain. Yes, except I would add linting rules, workspace linting rules, saying that, and this is why we're adding the tags. Let's go find the tags of this library. So the crisis center data access, it has two tags: scope crisis center and type data access. So once I add ESLint to this workspace, I will set up the narwhal workspace lint rules, and I will use these tags to define architectural boundaries and rules about valid dependencies. So one of them will be probably something like only a feature library can import a data access library, or maybe other data access libraries can also import data access libraries. And the second rule applicable here is only Scope Crisis Center can import libraries that have the Scope Crisis Center tag. And in this way, we would prevent other domains from importing anything from this Crisis Center data access module. So this is an example of where NX is helping us. Once we add the workspace lint rules, which are usually there when you generate an NX workspace, but this is a migrated Angular CLI workspace, which was using TSLint, and I just haven't gotten around to setting up ESLint yet. That's going to be quite a task because I need to add configurations to every single library, and I'm creating more and more libraries now, so it's going to be fun and tedious. I see here I forgot to add the type domain tag to this Crisis Center domain library we created not too long ago. And everything else seems to have nice tags, except for the original project here, 2 of Heroes app, scope, 2 of Heroes. I don't know. What's the scope? 2 of Heroes app. The type is app. So we could set up rules for that as well, saying app projects can only import shells, for example, shell libraries. If we had a shell library type, we don't, but we have, instead, our shell library has the type of feature. So we can say the app can only import feature libraries, for example, which is another reason for maybe you wanted a shell type, so that we can say apps can only import shells, shells can only import features and data access, and whatever we see is reasonable. Okay, I'm glad it makes sense, Alex. Thank you for your question. Let's see where we were. We were at the crisis lint component. It now seems to have everything it needs. It will most likely compile with the rest of the application. Add missing tags. Very good. So now that we have our crisis list component working with a scam and a feature module, and yeah, I was just wondering, should this have been a UI library? But no, this is not a presentational component. It's injecting a service and not a presenter service. So it's not a presentational service, it's a state service or something like that, right? So which makes it a smart component of some sort. But yeah, I guess it's a mixed component because it's also rendering this data. So yeah, it's a mixed component, not a container component or a presentation component. It's a mix of both. But yeah, it's a smart component. It's injecting a service and it's consuming the data of that service. So it should be in a feature library. UI libraries can contain, on the other hand, UI libraries can contain presentational components, presenters, so that's presenter services, which are presentational services. It can also contain directives and pipes, and maybe a service used for presentational purposes. Presenters is one, but I think we actually had one down here. We have a service for, no, here in the dialogues UI library, we have a dialogue service. This is a presentational concern, so that's why it's in this UI library. Okay, so the crisis list component is inside of a feature list, and it may look like this is an awfully tiny library. It only has one component basically. But remember, this is just a tutorial. A real app might be a lot more complicated than just this one list. It might have a data grid and several sub components and so on. Even this one could be split into a container component and a presentation component, and maybe some child components, presentational components, and so on. So it's a pretty simple example. So it should it's more like an early application prototype or something like that. It's definitely not a real world application, this Two of Heroes router tutorial. Yeah. So let's go back now to our shell library. And now we can start adding our first child route. So let's go back here to the original routing module and steal it from here, the crisis list component. But I won't include its child routes. So I will only add the route for the crisis list component for now. And to do that, I need to import something from add Two of Heroes, Crisis Center feature list, autocomplete, Crisis Center feature list module. Oh, and the component, hopefully. No. Did I not export that? Feature list, index TS. No. Okay. I need to import that component so that I can route to it. Here it is. Certainly, I also need the module. So I need to import that here, the feature module, so that I can route to this component inside of that module. This tells us that when we do this, the crisis list component and everything inside of this module becomes part of the bundle of this shell library. So even though we have them in separate workspace libraries, they will, based on my understanding of Angular and Webpack and all that, they will share a bundle, the Crisis Center shell bundle, because this is not lazy loaded. So yeah, I would actually do set up this route. Have like so instead, right? Import heroes, what's it called? The Crisis Center feature list. Then module, yeah, like so. I would create another lazy loading boundary here. Maybe, unless it hurts performance. But yeah, my point is we will be chunking everything. Does that make sense? Yeah, it might make sense right now because this list of crises is always shown on this crisis page or inside of this shell. So yeah, maybe it's good enough for now, but usually in a real application, you might even start to add another lazy loading boundary, so introducing another chunk of the application at this place in the route hierarchy. Also, to kind of keep the structure of this application and not change the code too much, except for splitting it up into all these libraries. That's another reason we're going to stick with this one, this routing structure for now, even though it does add to the size of this chunk of the application. Good. So I will commit this. This is a refactor, add list route. So now the final step, I think, is extracting these two services, or sorry, these two components here, the crisis detail component and the crisis center home component. So where do they belong? Let's look at the libraries we have. Do they belong in the feature shell? No, most definitely not. Do they belong in the feature list? Maybe. It could be a nice starting point. Like we could just create another folder here, or just paste them in, right? These two, move them up here. Yeah, that could be a good starting point. Especially since there's no lazy loading boundary here. And we're not looking to change that, at least not right now. So yeah, I mean, a detail component or feature is also kind of related to the list component or the list feature, at least especially when they're shown at the same time, and they are in this app. We'll open it once we finish this refactoring. What about the home component? Well, doesn't really have much to do with the list, but because of the way this app is currently structured, yeah, let's do that. Let's take these two folders with components, cut them out, and add them to the feature list library. And now we again get this problem of, oh, they don't have a module, they don't have a scam, so we have to create scams for them. Crisis center, home, module. Yes, this is going to be an ng module. The name of crisis center home module. It's going to declare crisis center home component. It's not going to export it because it's a routed component, but we're probably going to need some imports. So let's go look at them. Template of this. Yeah, that's a simple one. So actually, we don't need any imports. Nice. So we need a scam for the crisis detail component. It's called the crisis detail module. Crisis detail module. Declare exactly one component, the crisis detail component. That's a sad import. Much cleaner. So does it need imports? Let's have a look at its template. Yeah, there's something in here. And the Angular language service is certainly complaining. Can't bind to ng module. It's not a known property of input. So ng module, which Angular module would that be for using that directive? Right, it's the forms module, isn't it? There we go, and now the error message is gone. There's nothing else. Well, ngF, that's kind of interesting, because ngF, to use that, we need the common module, but we don't have that in this scam right now. Maybe Visual Studio Code is just confused somehow, but I definitely need to add the common module now so that we can use ngf. Here we go. Another scam. And okay, just committing this. Some things are broken right now. We're going to fix it very soon. Move crisis, move detail and home components to list feature. Okay. Okay, so yeah, final step of extracting things out from this page module here. Crisis center routing module, we have these two grandchildren routes or whatever the nesting level is at this point. We want to take them and move them into the shell library, shell module, right here. And now we need access to these components, the detail component, the home component, and of course these other services right here. I think that can deactivate guard is available from data access navigation. Oh, that wasn't a pretty import for some reason. There we go. Now we need access to these two components, so we have to export them from the feature list library. Export are from lib, crisis center home. We both need the module, but also the component. And organizing alphabetically here. And another one is crisis detail slash component and slash module. Yeah. There we go. Now we can import them. But to be able to route to them, now we need to import them here. So now we need to say crisis center home module. Let's just verify that import. Oh, it got ugly. Man. It should be here in this one. Crisis center home module and crisis detail module. But all from the feature list library inside of a crisis center domain. Crisis center detail module. What was it called? Crisis detail module. Yeah. Now we import the scams. They are declared and we can route to them. But we're also in this situation again that we can see that they're not lazy loaded. They're eagerly loaded as part of this shell library, which means that this whole domain is currently in one big chunk. But that's the way it already was in this application. So we'll leave it this way for now, but there's certainly room for improvement. You're asking, Alexander, if I have plans to have one data access library per domain or one for each feature lib. It depends. Right now, we only have the crisis service for this domain, and that's the reason I only created one data access. But in real big applications, you most certainly are going to have, or it makes sense often to have multiple data access libraries. Maybe you have two different web APIs or WebSockets, whatever, but you're only using it in this one domain, so you should scope it to this domain until you reach the point where you will be sharing those web APIs between multiple domains or multiple applications. Then we can hoist them or raise them up to a shared grouping folder instead, and just move those data access libraries into there, which is another point in favor of having these reasonably granular data access libraries, for example, one per web API. But right now it's sweet and simple, so we just need this one data access library. But we do need that data access library because this crisis service is reused between multiple features, even though it seems that they're all ending up in this one list feature library now. But that's something I would change. I would lazy load them. So I would take these detail and home and put them into separate features, even though they're very simple in this tutorial application. In real application, they would be more detailed, so they would almost certainly warrant for it would make sense to create a separate feature library for each of them, in my opinion and my experience. But yes, certainly. I another thing I read from your question here is I put data services in data access libraries. I don't put them in feature libraries. I mean, you can, if it makes sense to you, feel free to keep them inside the feature library. To me, they almost, it makes sense to put them in data access libraries. That way, it's a really focused library. It's easier to test in isolation because you certainly don't need any Angular UI or anything like that to test them. They're even candidates for reuse across frameworks and things like that because they're not, in the perfect world, they're not Angular specific, but if we look into a service like this one, it has this injectable provider, right? There's ways to get around this. But a behavior subject, for example, is not inherently Angular specific. And think about something like Akita, which is also framework agnostic. Yeah, enough about that. Hello. I'll try to pronounce your name. Sorry if I get it wrong. Gaurav? Gawao? In Danish? I don't know. Where are you from? You're asking, Gaurav, does the UI libs... Oh, can you also have a UI library per domain or per feature? Yes. That. Okay. You're from India. Nice to meet you, Gaurav. So, does it make sense to have, let's say, a single UI library per domain or per feature? It depends, and there's no. I mean, the other things I said is just my opinion. It's based on my experience. You can whatever makes sense to you. Just make sure to stay consistent in the workspace and agree with your team about this. But regarding UI and feature libraries, okay, so say we only had this crisis list component here in this feature list library. This is a mixed component, meaning it's both a container component and a presentational component. And because it's both, it's neither. So it's a mixed component. It has presentational concerns, and it also has like the glue between the data access layer and the presentational layer. That's a container component. So it's a mixed component. If, say, we split this into a crisis list container component and a crisis list presentational component, would it then make sense to have UI list library, which only contained that one presentational crisis list component? If it makes sense to you, you could do that. Or maybe if instead of just one container component and one presentational component, say we had 3 container components and 3 presentation components. Now it could make more sense to have a UI library that fits with every component or most of the components inside of this feature library. The good thing about starting to extract presentational components into UI libraries is that at some point, it turns out that they start to look alike. Like some patterns start to arise in some applications, so that I have a list component. I could make that more abstract. I could reuse it between multiple features or multiple domains, multiple applications. It's obvious with something like a component or another user control, say a country picker or something like that. But even with something like a list component, you might start to see, once you extract all these presentational components, you start to see similar patterns. And we shouldn't generalize or make it abstract too early, because it might be a coincidence that the components look similar. But extracting the presentational components and even putting them in UI libraries allows us to start seeing those patterns and see, does it make sense to make a more generic component out of this? Or how many places do I have this duplicate code in? And so it can make sense. Do we need just one per feature or one per domain? Maybe if it's a very small domain, we can start with just one feature library and one UI library. Or maybe we can just start with one feature library and put everything in there. And usually that's what I start by doing. I have just one feature library I have a feature library for this list feature, but I will split this mixed component into a container component and a presentational component, but I will keep them both here in this library until the feature starts to grow. Then I might be thinking about whether I would put them in a UI library. If I put them in a UI library, another benefit is I might start to get something like Storybook starts to make more sense. I could do that in a feature library as well, but presentational components and classes are just different from the smart components and the routed components and the shell components and the page components. So the presentation components belong in UI libraries. But of course, shouldn't make the libraries too granular. We shouldn't have just one container component in here and one presentation component in a UI list library. Yeah. So it depends. But certainly we can have one UI library for a domain and one for a feature. That can make sense in some circumstances, or to start out. And that's similar to how here we see that I'm starting out with just one domain library for this crisis-centered domain and one data access library for this crisis-centered domain, because I have just one service with some fake data in it. That's all it has. And I have just one interface inside of here, one domain entity inside of this domain. So I don't have a reason to have multiple data access libraries, multiple domain libraries right now inside of the crisis center. But that could change. It could change. I could also have called this one the domain dash crisis. Could have called this one data access dash crisis, so that I wouldn't have to rename them once the need for multiple libraries occurs. But then again, I might be trying to come up with a clever name too early. And it's nice to start by having these junk libraries, and then once you start putting things inside of them, you realize, oh, these are not really related, are they? So maybe I should have two domain libraries, or maybe I should have two data access libraries. So it's a good starting point to have one data access for a library for domain, one domain library, and in some cases one feature library. Maybe it's the feature page library is a good starting point, and in some cases maybe just one UI library. Yeah, it's a good starting point for new domains or new applications. And Gaurav, you have seen one per domain in the Angular Spotify repo. Yeah, so that's a recent one. I don't remember who created it, but it's a Spotify clone created with Angular. And you're saying there was one UI library for each domain. Yeah, well, it's certainly a very valid pattern to be using. But at some point, the feature grows, and then you don't want to have just one UI junk library with things that are not really related, other than the fact that they're used somewhere in the same big domain. So good starting point, but as the application or the domain or the whatever you want to call it, the page, the feature, as it grows, one library will become too broad. It needs to be more granular. We need to have things that have cohesion, that are related to each other, so that when we make changes, we affect the parts of the application that are actually affected, not just because everything is importing from this one UI library inside of everything in this domain is importing from that one UI library. So that works against NX tooling. So it's not good for a big domain. Yeah. I'm going to take just a 5-minute break. So you get to look at this back from the break. Thank you for hanging in there. It's been 2 hours, but let's see if we can finally finish this. Started by extracting the shell library from this one junk page feature library. We ended up extracting a data access library, a domain library, this list feature, which actually has multiple components inside of here, and of course the shell library itself. So how close are we to finishing this thing? Okay, there is one more issue. Oh, I have uncommitted changes. Yeah. Should I commit them now? Yeah, I should. Move this child routes shell. Good. And now I can worry about this final one, the crisis detail resolver service. What on earth is that? So it's probably here in the feature page library. There it is, crisis detail resolver service. So it's a route resolver, and it resolves a crisis. So a route resolver works in the way that there will be route data available once this route is loaded, so the crisis detail component. In that route data, there will be a property named crisis, and it will have the value that is resolved through this service. So the service has a resolve method. It gets this activated route snapshot, which has a parameter map with the ID part, which corresponds to this ID in the route. So the ID of the crisis we want to look the details for. It then takes the CS, is probably crisis service. Yeah, here it is. Get crisis. So the crisis details for that ID. Going to take the first value of this observable, and then if there's data, so if it's a valid ID, basically, we return the observable of that crisis. If there's no crisis with that ID, it will actually route back to the crisis center top level feature route and return an empty observable. Good. So this crisis detail resolver service is related to this crisis detail component, or specifically its route. So it should be located in the same location as this crisis detail component. So where is that? Well, yeah, where's that located? Let's go to the definition. It's here. So we need that same resolver service in the we need to move that up here to crisis detail, and we can have it in that, even though it was a component and a module folder, and now we have this service inside of here. That is perfectly fine. So, but the thing is, now we need to export that from this feature list library. So here, the crisis detail resolver service is now exported from this library. And now we can start to see that how related are these things? I mean, do I want to load all of this in a chunk? I mean, all of this is one chunk. That's not very performance oriented. I mean, it might be better to lazy load them on demand, right? And that's usually what I would do. And maybe we'll do that and run some experiments some other time. For now we have exported it, which means that the shell module is now able to import it. But that was another refactoring commit move. Crisis detail resolver to list feature. Okay, let's see where we're at now. Crisis center. Module, no red things, no red squigglies. This shell module, no red squigglies. The shell component, no red squigglies. Everything seems to be fine. So what do we have left in that original feature page library? Let's have a look. So basically, all of this, Crisis Center Home component is now gone. Crisis Center component, which is a shell component, is now gone. The detail and the list component is now gone. So what is this module doing at this point? It doesn't declare any components anymore, so we can remove these UI modules, widget modules. So at this point, it's importing this Crisis Center routing module. Let's open that up. And these are all the routes that we have just moved to our shell library. And we have home route, we have the detail route, we have the list route as well, and we have the Crisis Center component, which is the shell component. So at this point, this routing module is doing exactly nothing. And which means that this Crisis Center feature page module is doing absolutely nothing. So this whole feature page module, feature page library is now useless, obsolete. So let's remove the name of the project, which is Crisis Center feature page. And seems like it will even verify whether it's imported by someplace in our application, which it isn't at this point. So run. Now it's deleted, and it's deleted from the configuration files, nx.json, workspace.json, tsconfig-based.json. Very nice. Let's see. And it's gone. Sweet. Delete page feature library. Feature. There we go. All right. Exciting, because now let's have one thing here. Let's look at this dependency graph again. And let's focus on the Crisis Center feature shell, which is what we have created in this episode. So the Two of Heroes app, is everything still set up right? Oh, just a second. Managing too many screens right now. Okay, so we're still running. Good. Okay, so the Two of Heroes app is importing the Crisis Center feature shell, which is a Manfred Steyr shell library, which is then importing data access navigation and the Crisis Center list feature. If we focus on this one, we get a cleaner look here. We see that we have this shared library. It's a UI library with dialogues, which is also currently imported into the app. We see the Crisis Center domain library, which is used both by this list feature, but also by the data access library for the Crisis Center domain, which is in turn depending on this shared messages data access library. So basically everything up here is UI, presentational, of course also the UI library here. And this is our domain layer, and here is our data access layer. And here we see it by grouping folders. So this is what we have been doing today. We have structured the Crisis Center domain. Before it was just one page feature library, and it turned out we didn't even have well, you could say that we could also have called it, instead of a shell, we could have called it a page, because it contains basically the Crisis Center component, which is the Crisis Center page. But since, just to make it clear that this is we're using the shell pattern here, the shell library pattern, we call it the feature shell instead. And this should be little more than a router outlet, which is the case here. Maybe some shared, I don't know, menu, navigation, something like that. But even that should probably be extracted to its own library, UI, or feature library. So very little should be in here, typically in a shell component such as this one. You might also call it a page component. But now we have a shell library with a shell component, and it's importing this list feature, which, if you remember, has, what is it, like 3 components inside of it. And it's using this data access, it's using the domain, and some other time, let's do the same thing again, but for these other 3 domains, the heroes, the admin, and the auth domains. That will be a fun exercise. And another thing we could do is starting to optimize some things here. For example, lazy loading some of the components so that not everything will be in a single bundle, which basically right now everything inside of this whole grouping folder, even though it's divided into 4 libraries, they will be in the same chunk, is my guess based on experience with Angular and Webpack. So that was the dependency graph. Let's try now to start up the app, see if everything's working. Come on, Angular. We can see here which chunks are here. So we have a very tiny main file. These are development chunks, so they will be different in production. But just 81 kilobytes of the main bundle, that's pretty sweet. And 2 lazy chunks, the admin feature page and the Crisis Center feature shell. So that was what I was assuming was the case, that there's just one chunk with all the components and the data access services and all of that in just one bundle. I mean, it's not big, but it's only because it's not using something like Angular material or other UI component libraries. It's only using very simple styles. So this might already be an issue in a real application with a more feature-rich page with using a UI component library such as Angular material. Okay, let's look at the app. Zooming in. There it is. Let's go to Crisis Center. Oh, let's also open the console just to see. Here we go. Let's reload. Okay. Preloaded the Crisis Center because of this selective preloading strategy service. But let's go to the Crisis Center. And here's the sky full of great white sharks. Sky rains wallabies. Welcome to the Crisis Center. So this is actually that Crisis Center home component, and when we click a crisis, it will be the crisis detail component. Another thing just to see here is the chunks. Let's reload, disable the cache, and yeah. So this oh well, let's reload the default route, which is heroes. We still see this Crisis Center feature shell chunk is loaded because of this preloading strategy that is activated. Preloaded the Crisis Center. See the chunk here. It's 45 kilobytes. Yeah, but just one bundle. When we click the different components, we don't see any other lazy loaded chunk being loaded. So everything in one chunk. That is because of what we discussed. These imports, they're not lazy loaded either one of the routes inside of the domain. That's something we could change and optimize. So now we have this many projects inside of our workspace. It's starting to look like something. But remember, this was just extracting all the domains, the shared services, and so on, and trying to structure just one domain here, the Crisis Center domain, even to the point that I would probably put, if this was a real application, I would probably have the detail and the home. They would be in separate feature libraries. Yeah. That's how I would usually do it. One section of the page is one feature library. One dialog is either in a UI library or in a separate feature library or something like that. Yeah. Okay, let's push all of this. So now you can take a look at the code yourself if you want to. I will once again just put the repo here in the comments, and this article by Nacho Vasquez about the 3 different libraries, shell library patterns. And that's it. It was a long one, but it's also a very advanced topic, one that I recommend you read up on in that article by Nacho. And maybe try doing it to one of the other domains yourself. And maybe I'll do it in another episode. But I think there's 3 more domains, right? So you could do it try doing it yourself. And now you have an example of one of the domains. So try one of the other domains and see if you can figure out how to do it. Feel free to ask me questions. You can reach me on Twitter, or you can join our This is Learning public Discord server. But you can also send me a tweet or a direct message on Twitter, or any other place you see me hanging around. So that was it from NX After Dark. It is very dark now in Denmark, very dark and cold. And it's actually a new week now. We have passed midnight, and I have a long commute tomorrow, so it's going to be a long day. But it was fun hanging out, and thank you all for hanging in there. And thank you for the questions, Alexander, Garav, Corbin. Thank you for coming by. And yeah, I mean, this is a long episode, but lots of good topics to discuss, great questions. It's difficult to nail this shell library pattern, but it's really useful. And you could see that it forced us to think about our whole architecture from a structural standpoint. Okay, you read the article before, but it was difficult to understand. Yeah, you need to, I mean, we did our best to provide both visuals and code and explanation, but it became a 14-minute article because there are 3 parts and conclusions and all that. So, and also, yeah, I mean, if you don't see why you would need it, it probably doesn't make much sense. But it's something that is also, this pattern is described by Nawal in their Angular monorepo book. It's described by Manfred Steyer in his domain-driven design and micro frontends and monorepos book, or whatever it's called these days. It's a free ebook from Manfred Steyer. And then this third composite shell library pattern that adds some more, supports some more use cases, is the one Nacho and I made up for this article. Yeah, so now you've seen it in practice. You can go look at the code. It would be very fun to see you do the same thing for the other domains. So fork the repo and try doing it on your own. That will be very fun. I probably won't do all 3 of the other ones, the remaining ones, anytime soon. I mean, I might do another one if I get time, but probably not all of them. I'll find something else to do in this repo, like setting up the workspace lint rules, or maybe some additional tooling, or start adding tests, or something fun like that. So that's it for today. I hope you learned a lot. Feel free to ask me questions and keep learning. Bye for now.